The wind cut across the wire fences like a blade of glass. Snow clung to the boots of men who once marched in formation under a different flag. Inside the barbed perimeter, German prisoners huddled against the bitter air. Gray coats, hollow eyes, murmuring about when they might see home again. The world was quiet, except for the metallic rattle of a guard's rifle strap and the low hum of a distant generator. Then a voice broke the silence. Firm, calm, fluent. Achtung! Reihen bilden, sofort! Every German head turned at once. The command was perfect. Not the clumsy accent of an occupier, but the clipped authority of a native speaker. Confusion spread among the prisoners. Some straightened instinctively, obeying the sound before the thought caught up. One man whispered, "Wie kann das sein?" How could that be? Behind the wire stood an American sergeant. Uniform dusted with frost, eyes steady, words rolling in unmistakable German. For the first time, the defeated army realized their captors understood everything. By the winter of 1944, the Second World War had reached its cruel crescendo. The Allies had broken through the beaches of Normandy 6 months earlier, and what remained of Hitler's armies was retreating through the wreckage of France and Belgium. Across muddy roads and shattered villages, columns of captured German soldiers trudged westward. Thousands every week. They were the remains of once proud divisions, the 352nd Infantry, the 2nd Panzer, the remnants of the Waffen-SS. The Third Reich's war machine was no longer advancing. It was collapsing in slow motion. To the Americans, this flood of prisoners presented both a problem and an opportunity. Never before in modern warfare had so many enemy soldiers been captured alive, and never before had language been such a crucial weapon. From Normandy to the Hürtgen forest, every German surrender meant potential intelligence, troop strengths, fuel shortages, command confusion. But most interrogators faced a wall of silence. The Germans were disciplined, defiant, and deeply suspicious. To crack that wall, the U.S. Army needed more than firepower. It needed voices that could slip inside the enemy's mind. That search began long before the first German POWs set foot on Allied soil. In 1942, as America entered the war, a quiet effort began inside training camps and universities. The Army Specialized Training Program, ASTP, and the nascent Office of Strategic Services, OSS, combed through rosters for one specific skill: fluency in German. What they found was extraordinary. Thousands of immigrants, many of them Jewish refugees who had fled Europe only a few years earlier, now wearing American uniforms. They were professors, students, butchers, musicians, ordinary men who carried the enemy's language in their memory and the desire for justice in their hearts. By 1944, these men were being shaped into one of the most effective intelligence forces of the war. At Camp Ritchie, Maryland, a secluded training site tucked into the Appalachian foothills, an elite group of linguists, map analysts, and interrogators learned the art of psychological warfare. They would come to be known as the Ritchie Boys. Their mission was unlike any other: to understand the enemy not as a faceless opponent, but as a man, to speak his tongue, read his culture, anticipate his fears. When the Allied advance reached northern France, the impact of this training became visible in the most unexpected places: in prisoner cages, temporary camps, and field hospitals. An ordinary American corporal might stand beside a captured German sergeant, both shivering in the cold, yet separated by the gulf of defeat. Then suddenly the corporal would speak, not in English, but in the sharp dialect of Munich or Cologne. In that instant, the balance of power shifted. The German no longer faced a foreign conqueror. He faced someone who knew his words, his jokes, his oaths, his pride. It was the beginning of an entirely new kind of warfare, one fought through comprehension, not bullets. Across Western Europe, Allied command recognized how potent this advantage was. Interrogation units attached to divisions like Patton's Third Army began deploying bilingual soldiers at the front lines. Captured officers, once arrogantly silent, found themselves trapped in linguistic mirrors, questioned by Americans who spoke better German than they did English. The results were startling. Troop positions revealed, supply routes uncovered, resistance softened. But for the Germans, the psychological effect was deeper. They had been taught that their language was a fortress of superiority, that no outsider could truly master it. Hearing flawless German from a man wearing an American flag shattered that illusion. To many, it was as unnerving as defeat itself. The winter of 1944 was cold, dark, and uncertain. Yet amid the chaos, these quiet voices, the interpreters, the Ritchie boys, the translators at every POW compound, became invisible weapons. They didn't fire rifles or drop bombs, but they dismantled an army's morale one conversation at a time. And in one camp, somewhere in the snowy expanse of France, that invisible war took on its most human face. When German prisoners realized their every word, every whisper, was understood perfectly. The revelation would travel quickly through the ranks, carried on rumor and fear, but before that moment of shock, the groundwork had been years in the making. From classrooms in Maryland to battlefields in Normandy. To understand how American soldiers came to speak perfect German, one must look beyond the front lines, into the quiet corridors of training centers, universities, and intelligence offices that formed the unseen architecture of Allied strategy. By late 1943, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Europe, military planners faced a problem few had anticipated: how to communicate with the enemy once he surrendered. It wasn't enough to capture. They needed to comprehend. What began as an administrative concern quickly became a psychological weapon. In Washington, the War Department's Military Intelligence Division, along with the OSS, drew up a plan that would become a turning point in wartime intelligence. The idea was simple, but revolutionary: create an army of linguists and analysts who could think like the enemy. The birth of the linguist. Corps recruiters scoured refugee communities across the United States. Neighborhoods in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles filled with German and Austrian émigrés. Many were young men who had escaped persecution in the 1930s, leaving families behind in Europe. When war erupted, they volunteered in droves, motivated not just by duty but by something more personal: justice. At Camp Ritchie, Maryland, these recruits underwent one of the most demanding programs of the war. For 6 months, they trained in military terminology, interrogation methods, order of battle analysis, and psychological profiling. They studied Nazi rank insignias, dialects, and propaganda material until they could interpret the enemy's mindset as easily as his language. Among them were names history would only later recognize: Guy Stern, Werner Angris, Victor Brombert, and hundreds of others whose accents carried the echo of a Europe they could never return to. Their instructors emphasized one lesson above all: your tongue is your weapon. Learn to use it as precisely as a rifle. Operation Overlord and the Language Front. When D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, these linguists were scattered across units landing on the beaches of Normandy. They wore standard uniforms but carried no obvious insignia of their unique role. Some worked with frontline infantry, shouting surrender orders in German through loudspeakers as shells exploded around them. Others waited behind the lines, preparing to interrogate the first wave of captured officers. It was here that their training proved decisive. In the chaos of battle, prisoners who might have resisted traditional questioning often broke when addressed in their mother tongue, especially when that tongue came from someone wearing the enemy's uniform. A few even mistook these Americans for defectors or Germans in disguise. The results astonished Allied command. The intelligence gathered in those first weeks, from captured diaries, decoded messages, and prisoner confessions, revealed details about German defenses, fuel shortages, and unit morale that would have otherwise remained hidden. Eisenhower himself noted that linguistic intelligence had shortened the campaign in France by weeks. The human paradox, yet behind the success lay a deep irony. Many of the German-speaking Americans interrogating prisoners were Jews whose families had perished in concentration camps. Their professionalism under such emotional strain remains one of the quietest acts of heroism in the war. They were told to remain objective, to see their captives as sources of data, not vengeance. And most did, asking questions with the calm detachment of scholars, not soldiers. One Richie boy, reflecting decades later, said, "The moment I spoke German to them, I saw confusion in their eyes, as if the world had turned upside down. I was the refugee. Now I was the one asking the questions." This inversion of power, linguistic, moral, and psychological, reverberated across every POW camp established in Western Europe. The intelligence web expands by the autumn of 1944. As the Allies advanced toward the German border, dozens of interrogation centers operated under the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Centers, CSDIC. These facilities became laboratories of information, places where language could extract strategy from silence. Reports flowed daily from these centers to London and Washington, shaping decisions that affected entire divisions. The Germans who arrived at these camps often expected brutality. Instead, they found calm, efficient questioning, delivered in perfect German, with precise grammar and regional nuance. It was not just a surprise, it was disarming. Many prisoners confessed that hearing their captors speak their language fluently eroded their last sense of superiority. By the time the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December 1944, the Allies had perfected this new front, the front of communication. German POWs were not just disarmed of their weapons, but of their isolation. They were being understood, entirely and without mercy. The stage was now set for a new psychological confrontation, one where mastery of language could alter the course of intelligence warfare. And in the snow-covered camps of France and Belgium, that mastery would soon unfold in unforgettable scenes. The first reaction was always disbelief. When German POWs heard American guards, medics, or interrogators speaking perfect German, they assumed it was a trick, a phonetic rehearsal, a parroted phrase. But as sentences deepened and dialects shifted, they realized the truth. These men weren't mimicking. They belonged to the language. For prisoners raised on years of propaganda, the experience was unsettling. The Nazi regime had painted America as a nation of cultural inferiors, brash, mechanical, soulless. Yet here stood Americans who quoted Schiller, cursed in Bavarian slang, or addressed officers with the precise etiquette of Prussian formality. It shattered the myth of German intellectual supremacy in a single conversation. The human shock of understanding. Inside POW compounds across France, Belgium, and England, the sound of fluent German came like a quiet thunderclap. It stripped away the emotional armor prisoners had built. Language had been their last defense, the invisible wall separating us from them. When that wall collapsed, so did much of their confidence. Some responded with fear. They began whispering less, knowing their captors could understand every word. Others grew strangely respectful, even curious. A captured Wehrmacht officer once remarked to an interpreter, "It is a strange defeat when the enemy knows your tongue better than your allies." There were also moments of unexpected humanity. A young German conscript, barely 19, burst into tears when a Jewish-American interrogator from Berlin addressed him softly in their shared dialect. "Du klingst wie mein Bruder." "You sound like my brother." For a moment, both men were not soldier and prisoner, but two displaced souls speaking the same broken homeland. The psychology of power reversal. To German POWs, hearing perfect German from their captors inverted everything they believed about dominance. Language, once a tool of command, became a reminder of submission. The Americans' fluency implied not just understanding but mastery. Cultural, educational, psychological. This effect was especially profound among Nazi loyalists, who viewed German as sacred, a pure expression of the Aryan identity. To hear it spoken fluently by Americans, many of whom were refugees or Jewish immigrants, felt like poetic justice. It was the sound of an ideology collapsing under its own arrogance. At the same time, American interrogators understood this dynamic perfectly. They knew that speaking the prisoner's language removed barriers faster than threats. Interrogation manuals at the time emphasized empathy over intimidation. A calm tone in native German could unnerve a captured officer more than any display of aggression. As one Richie boy recalled decades later, "The more human I sounded, the more their defenses cracked. They expected monsters, not men who knew their lullabies." The language as weapon language became a silent weapon, one that cut deeper than bullets. Fluent Americans could quote German field orders, cite Nazi slogans, and even recite lines from Mein Kampf during questioning, proving they knew the regime from the inside out. The shock of recognition often made prisoners lower their guard. In psychological terms, it was a complete role inversion. The captor became the cultural insider. The captive became the outsider. It was as if the war had turned inside out. Victory measured not in territory, but in comprehension. A mirror of humanity, yet, for all its strategic advantage, the shared language also created moments of uncomfortable intimacy. Translators often admitted feeling sympathy for their captives. Some heard familiar idioms, jokes, or songs that reminded them of the lives they'd left behind. Interrogations occasionally ended with quiet exchanges about home cities, Berlin, Hamburg, Vienna, spoken in the same tone one might use between old friends. Still, professionalism prevailed. The American linguists never forgot what their understanding was meant to serve: the war effort. But beneath the official reports and debriefings, one truth lingered. The closer they got to understanding the enemy, the harder it became to hate him completely. The human mind, it seemed, could be disarmed as effectively as a rifle, with nothing more than a few well-chosen words in the right tongue. And while the psychological ripples of this power dynamic played out in every camp, a second front was developing quietly, one that would use language not just for emotion, but for cold, precise extraction of secrets. The power of language in wartime intelligence was never abstract. It was measurable, tactical, and immediate. By late 1944, the U.S. Army had transformed German fluency into a weapon of precision. Every fluent soldier, interpreter, and interrogator became a moving node in an intelligence web stretching from the front lines to the Pentagon. Intelligence through comprehension. On the battlefield, seconds mattered. During the rapid Allied advance through France, American units often stumbled upon abandoned command posts filled with papers, maps, and coded field orders. Before these could be of use, they had to be understood, instantly. That's where bilingual soldiers stepped in. They translated on the spot, turning chaos into clarity. What had once been meaningless symbols became real intelligence: divisions, coordinates, morale reports. In some cases, language fluency directly saved lives. When German POWs were brought in after combat, interrogators could extract critical data: artillery ranges, mine placements, and ambush warnings, within hours of capture. Because the Americans spoke like natives, prisoners rarely realized how much they'd revealed until it was too late. A single correct translation could redirect an entire column or prevent an ambush. Reports from the European Theater of Operations credit several such instances with reducing U.S. casualties in late 1944. The interrogation, craft interrogation, became a battlefield art. Manuals distributed to U.S. intelligence officers, such as the War Department's Field Manual 3015, outlined the essential principle: understanding breeds control. Speaking the enemy's language was the first step toward that control. American interrogators learned to modulate tone, phrasing, and even grammar to manipulate prisoner behavior. A harsh, clipped Prussian accent could assert dominance. A soft Bavarian lilt could evoke trust. Interrogators played psychological chess, through syntax, feigning ignorance, slipping into dialects, or quoting German poetry to unnerve their captives. One OSS officer later described it as a war of nerves waged in perfect grammar. These interactions were never random. Every question, every pause, was calculated. Even silence could be a weapon. When prisoners realized their captors understood everything, even their muttered complaints, a kind of linguistic claustrophobia set in. It became impossible to hide behind words. tactical deception, and counterintelligence. The use of fluent German went beyond interrogation. It entered the realm of deception, trickery as strategy. Before the Battle of the Bulge, Allied intelligence units used German-speaking soldiers in radio transmissions and intercepted chatter to mislead enemy signals operators. In one instance, fake communications, delivered in flawless German, convinced parts of the Wehrmacht that an American division was positioned miles away from its actual location. Such operations, though rarely publicized, became templates for post-war intelligence tradecraft. The CIA and later NATO psychological operations units would borrow heavily from these techniques, proving that language dominance equaled information dominance. Another key use came during prisoner transfers. Fluent American guards could overhear conversations between POWs, gathering intelligence unintentionally revealed in casual talk. These snippets, often more honest than formal interrogations, provided insights into morale, food shortages, and unit cohesion within the collapsing German front. Language as strategy. By winter 1944, fluency in German wasn't just a skill, it was doctrine. Commanders understood that cultural literacy could achieve what brute force could not. German-speaking Americans were embedded within divisions like Patton's Third Army and Bradley's First Army. They traveled with the front, interpreting captured orders, interrogating prisoners, even negotiating civilian surrenders. Their reports flowed upward through G2 intelligence channels, informing operational decisions at the Corps and Army level. The Ritchie boys, often just young men in their early 20s, influenced campaigns far beyond their rank. A translated map here, a decoded message there. Together they altered the rhythm of the war. For the Germans, the discovery of such mastery was humiliating. Many officers confessed in post-war interviews that the Allies' ability to anticipate movements felt supernatural. Few realized that behind it lay not sorcery, but syntax, a network of minds trained to listen better than anyone else. A new kind of warfare, World War II, had revealed a new dimension of conflict, the war of understanding. It wasn't about who shouted louder, but who listened deeper. In an age defined by tanks and bombers, victory had also depended on verbs and vowels. And now, as the Ardennes offensive loomed, that mastery of language would be tested under the harshest conditions yet. For in the frozen forests of Belgium, intelligence itself would become a weapon, and one conversation could change the outcome of an entire battle. The snow fell without sound. December 18, 1944, the second day of the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. Allied lines were folding under the surprise assault. American outposts were swallowed by fog and confusion, and retreating soldiers stumbled through pine forests, unsure of where the front even was. The cold was merciless. The roads were clogged with ice, smoke, and fear. In a small Belgian farmhouse near St. Vith, a handful of U.S. intelligence officers had turned a kitchen into an improvised interrogation room. A potbelly stove hissed in the corner, offering the only warmth for miles, the smell of burnt wood mixed with wet wool and tobacco. Outside, trucks rumbled eastward, headlights dimmed, engines muffled, part of an army scrambling to survive. Inside sat Captain Martin Strauss, a 27-year-old intelligence officer from New York. He had been born in Frankfurt and escaped Germany in 1938 with his family. Now he wore the uniform of the United States Army, a triangle patch on his shoulder, a Colt .45 on his belt, and the quiet confidence of a man whose weapon was language. Across the table sat a captured German officer, Hauptmann Erich Keller, a company commander from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. His uniform was caked with frost. His right sleeve was torn from a grenade burst. His eyes burned with fatigue and suspicion. He had refused to speak English since his capture that morning. Strauss didn't start with threats. He began with grammar. "Herr Hauptmann," he said in flawless, accentless German, "Ihre Division ist müde." Ihre Männer frieren und sie wissen, dass die Versorgung abgeschnitten ist. Your division is exhausted. Your men are freezing, and you know your supply line is cut off. Keller's expression flickered. A flash of surprise, then calculation. He shifted in his chair. Sie sind Deutscher? You're German? Strauss shook his head slowly. Nein. Amerikaner. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. The crackling stove filled the space between two men who, by chance of birth, could have shared a street, a school, even a language teacher. But now they sat on opposite sides of history. Keller tried to reclaim control. You people don't understand this war, he muttered, switching abruptly to English, his accent sharp. You fight without discipline, without honor. Strauss leaned forward, voice calm, steady. Discipline? You ambushed a hospital convoy yesterday. I read the report. 13 medics dead. He slid a photograph across the table, a snow-covered jeep, a red cross riddled with bullet holes. Keller's jaw tightened. Strauss didn't press. He changed tone, softer now, conversational. Tell me, Hauptmann, he said in German again, how many tanks are left in your regiment? Keller stared at him, silent. Strauss waited. He lit a cigarette and handed one across the table. Keller hesitated, then took it. For a moment, the war retreated outside the farmhouse walls. The two men sat as smoke curled upward, a brief illusion of peace. Then Keller spoke. Not an answer, but a deflection. The Führer has reserves you Americans can't imagine. Strauss exhaled, steady, calculating. Then you have nothing to lose by telling me where they are. It was the oldest trick in interrogation. Patience disguised as indifference. He never raised his voice, never showed anger. He simply listened. Every hesitation, every slip in verb tense, every glance told him more than direct answers could. Within 20 minutes, he had learned enough to confirm that Keller's regiment had crossed near Losheimer Graben, and that their supply line was already overstretched. Strauss signaled the stenographer. The report was drafted immediately and sent by radio to division headquarters. Within hours, U.S. artillery units had adjusted their fire zones, cutting off the enemy's corridor to St. Vith. That night, while Keller sat in the dim glow of the stove, Strauss walked outside into the falling snow. He could hear distant gunfire echoing through the forest, each thud a reminder that intelligence wasn't an abstraction. Words had weight, and in this war, fluency could kill. The ripple effect, by morning, the captured officer's information proved decisive. The German advance around St. Vith slowed, bogged down by Allied counterfire. Intelligence summaries later credited information obtained from a German-speaking officer as instrumental in delaying the 26th Volksgrenadiers' flank. But for Strauss, the moment that stayed with him wasn't the victory. It was Keller's final remark as he was escorted away. I never thought I'd fear my own language. That single sentence captured the paradox of the war. Conflict where understanding could be more devastating than hatred. As the snow thickened, and the last convoys rolled toward Bastogne, one truth had become clear. The ability to speak like the enemy had just saved hundreds of lives. By dawn on December 19, 1944, the sky over the Ardennes had turned to iron. The storm that blanketed Belgium in snow had grounded Allied aircraft and cloaked German troop movements, a calculated gift of weather that Hitler believed would ensure surprise. Yet deep within that chaos, a different kind of clarity was emerging, one built on information, not sunlight. Captain Strauss's report from St. Vith moved fast. Within hours, it was decoded, authenticated, and routed through the channels of 8 Corps headquarters. There, a web of analysts and officers translated the interrogation transcript into actionable intelligence. The details, unit designations, fuel conditions, and direction of advance matched intercepted radio chatter and captured documents. It was the missing puzzle piece. The ripple through command. By midday, this linguistic intelligence reached the desk of General Bruce Clark, commander of Combat Command B of the 7th Armored Division. Clark had been holding St. Vith under relentless pressure from the German 18th Volksgrenadier and 26th Infantry Divisions. The information from Strauss confirmed his suspicion. The enemy was overstretched, running low on fuel and ammunition, and attempting to outflank through the forest roads east of town. Armed with that knowledge, Clark made a decision that would alter the course of the battle. He ordered a defensive pivot, concentrating his armor to block the Losheimer-Graben corridor. When German tanks rolled forward hours later, they were met not by a retreating American line, but by a wall of anti-tank fire guided by precise coordinates. The German offensive slowed. What Hitler had envisioned as a lightning strike toward Antwerp began to lose momentum, not because of overwhelming force, but because of understanding. The network expands Strauss was not alone. Across the front, dozens of bilingual interrogators and intelligence officers repeated the same quiet miracle, turning conversation into foresight. In Bastogne, Lieutenant Frederick Mayer, another German-speaking American from the OSS, helped confirm the composition of incoming enemy units before the town was surrounded. At Spa, Ritchie Boy teams translated captured field orders revealing the disguised infiltration of German commandos under Otto Skorzeny, information that triggered immediate changes in checkpoint protocols and saved Allied commanders from possible assassination. Language had become the invisible lifeline of the Ardennes defense. Every phrase extracted from a prisoner rippled outward. Show, from icy farmhouses to map tables, from whispered interrogations to artillery grids. Intelligence officers began calling this the language edge. It wasn't glamorous, but it was decisive. The Battle of Mainz-in, a war defined by machines. The Battle of the Bulge was ultimately shaped by mines. The Germans fought with tanks and fog. The Americans countered with comprehension. The interrogators were not generals or strategists. They were often privates, corporals or lieutenants, men whose voices could unlock enemy plans faster than a captured document ever could. As the battle dragged into its second week, the effect became undeniable. American divisions that had initially been caught off guard began anticipating enemy maneuvers. Commanders credited rapidly acquired intelligence for enabling timely counterattacks around Bastogne and Elsenborn Ridge, both turning points in the campaign. Even after the snow subsided and the front stabilized, reports continued to circulate about mysterious interrogators who seemed to know the German order of battle by heart. In truth, they were often refugees, once voiceless, now decisive. The irony of victory. By January 1945, the German offensive had collapsed. What remained of the Wehrmacht's Western armies fell back toward the Rhine, leaving behind burned vehicles, frozen bodies, and tens of thousands of prisoners. Among them were officers who could not reconcile their defeat with what they had witnessed. Americans who spoke German as flawlessly as they did. In one recorded debriefing, a captured colonel reportedly muttered, "They conquered us with our own words." That phrase found its way into post-war analyses at the Military Intelligence Service. It was a concise truth. While artillery and armor had delivered the blows, intelligence, carried by the tongues of men like Strauss, had guided where to strike. Legacy and doctrine. When the Army's after-action reports were compiled, a quiet recommendation appeared in multiple divisions: maintain specialized linguistic units for all future conflicts. This became the seed of what would later evolve into the U.S. Army Intelligence Corps and post-war translation branches, in both Europe and the Pacific. The lesson was clear. Mastery of language was mastery of perception. For Captain Martin Strauss, the victory was bittersweet. His role remained classified, his name buried in field reports and microfilm. But every time he replayed that December night in his memory, the snow, the stove, the trembling German officer realizing his captor understood him perfectly, he knew the truth. In that moment, words had saved a city. The snow kept falling. The guns kept firing, but beneath it all, the quiet war of understanding had already been won. By February 1945, the Ardennes forest had fallen silent again. The snow was melting, revealing the remnants of the battle. Scorched trees, frozen helmets half buried in mud, the ghostly outlines of trenches that once marked the edge of Hitler's final gamble in the West. The guns had gone quiet, but another kind of echo remained, one that lived not in the ground, but in the minds of the men who had fought, spoken, and surrendered there. For thousands of German prisoners, captivity under the Americans became a lesson in dissonance. Many entered the camps braced for cruelty, shaped by months of propaganda that painted the U.S. Army as a barbaric mechanical force. Instead, they found order, discipline, and, to their astonishment, communication. The same men who had once barked orders in English they couldn't understand now spoke to them in perfect German, with calm authority and even civility. In dozens of POW compounds scattered across France, Belgium, and England, the conversations that began on the battlefield continued. Some were official interrogations. Others were the ordinary exchanges of daily life. A guard asking a prisoner about his hometown, a medic explaining treatment, a chaplain offering prayer. Yet in each moment the power dynamic was quietly redefined. The language of the defeated had become the bridge of control. The collapse of myth for German officers, this realization cut deep. They had been taught that the Reich's superiority rested not only on weapons, but on intellect, that the German language itself was proof of cultural dominance. Hearing it spoken fluently by the enemy dismantled that illusion. The humiliation was not violent. It was intellectual. Every word the Americans uttered in flawless grammar was a reminder that their supposed inferiors had outthought them. One POW later wrote in his post-war diary, "We lost not only to their tanks and planes, but to their understanding. They knew our tongue, our books, our songs, and still they beat us." The fluency of American interrogators turned captivity into something more complex than defeat. It was reflection forced upon pride. Some prisoners admitted that their first conversations in German with American officers were the most unnerving experiences of the entire war. "It was as if the world had turned inside out," recalled one corporal. "We had believed language separated us from them, but suddenly it united us." The interrogators' burden for the American side, particularly for the Ritchie boys and other bilingual soldiers, the aftermath was equally complicated. They had performed their duty with professionalism, extracting intelligence, translating documents, and maintaining composure even when faced with men who once upheld the ideology that had destroyed their families. Yet when the shooting stopped, the emotional toll surfaced. Many later confessed that the hardest part was not hatred, it was empathy. Hearing a captured German speak in the same dialect as one's childhood, or mention a city once called home, blurred the moral boundaries of war. Some soldiers avoided using German after the armistice, unable to separate the language of their birth from the trauma it carried. Others found healing in reclaiming it, proof that culture could outlive tyranny. At Camp Ritchie and other debriefing centers, returning interrogators were quietly honored for their service, though their missions remained classified for decades. They received no medals for valor. Their victories had been waged in silence, in rooms filled with typewriters, cigarettes, and the rhythm of translated words. Captivity as classroom as months turned into years, the POW camps themselves evolved. Many German prisoners were put to work rebuilding destroyed infrastructure, translating captured archives, or even helping Allied intelligence identify Nazi officials. Fluent American officers often facilitated these transitions, guiding prisoners through paperwork and debriefings in impeccable German. Some camps became microcosms of reconciliation, where communication replaced suspicion. Letters from prisoners to their families, censored but preserved in archives, often mention this shock of mutual respect. One former Wehrmacht lieutenant wrote home in April 1945, "The Americans who guard us are not the monsters we were told of. One speaks my language as if he were born in Dresden. He told me his parents were killed there. Still, he shows me mercy. I do not understand this war anymore." Such moments did not erase the brutality of the conflict, but they added dimension to its end. They revealed that understanding, the very skill that broke the enemy's will, could also soften the edges of hatred. The war in Europe was nearing its conclusion, but for both captor and captive, the memory of those conversations would linger long after the last shots were fired. For the prisoners, the sound of perfect German spoken by Americans became the final reminder of defeat. For the Americans, it was the sound of reclamation, of language, of justice, of humanity restored. When Germany finally surrendered on May 8, 1945, victory arrived not with the roar of triumph, but with a weary silence. The guns fell quiet. The prisoners sat stunned behind barbed wire, and the world exhaled for the first time in 6 years. Yet beneath the surface of celebration, a quieter revolution had already taken root, one born not of weapons, but of words. From camp to classroom, in the months that followed, Allied command turned its attention to rebuilding Europe and dismantling the Nazi regime. Thousands of German POWs remained in American custody, many now cooperative, even grateful for humane treatment. Their interactions with fluent American interrogators had reshaped their perception of the enemy. Respect, born of surprise, had replaced propaganda-fed contempt. At debriefing centers in England and the United States, teams of linguists and analysts began cataloging captured German archives. Millions of documents, from Wehrmacht orders to Gestapo files. The same men who once interrogated prisoners now translated the written skeleton of a fallen empire. Their work exposed the administrative machinery of the Reich, the logistics of genocide, the orders of mass deportation, the minute bureaucracy of evil. For many of the Ritchie boys and intelligence linguists, this was both professional duty and personal reckoning. Captain Martin Strauss, like so many of his peers, returned briefly to Camp Ritchie after the war. He trained a new generation of officers in the art of linguistic intelligence, a term that would soon become doctrine. In 1947, when the U.S. formally established the Army Intelligence Corps, the manuals written by these wartime linguists served as foundational texts. Their methods, empathy, precision, and psychological insight, became pillars of Cold War intelligence training. The influence on post-war intelligence. The lessons learned in 1944 to 45 rippled far beyond Europe. The OSS, which had coordinated many of these operations, evolved into the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. Its early leadership included veterans of Camp Ritchie and the Military Intelligence Service Language School. They brought with them a new principle, that understanding the enemy's culture and language was as vital as any weapon. During the early Cold War, this philosophy shaped America's approach to global intelligence. The practice of embedding linguists and cultural experts into military operations became standard. What had begun with a few thousand German-speaking soldiers became a template for future conflicts. Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East. The Ritchie boys themselves dispersed across the world. Some became professors, diplomats, or historians. Others worked quietly in intelligence for decades. Their influence endured long after their names faded from public record. When declassified documents finally revealed their wartime role, historians recognized them as one of the most effective intelligence assets in World War II, responsible for gathering over 60% of actionable intelligence in the European theater. The human bridge between enemies. For many German POWs, captivity under American custody, and the shock of hearing their language spoken perfectly by their captors, became a defining memory of the war. In post-war interviews, several described it not as humiliation, but as awakening. They realized that the world they had been taught to despise was, in fact, one that understood them better than their own leaders ever had. Some former prisoners later emigrated to the United States, citing those early encounters as the first time they saw Americans as humans rather than enemies. A handful even corresponded with their former interrogators, letters written in the same fluent German that had once unmade their resistance. One letter, preserved in an archive at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, reads simply, "When you spoke my language, you broke my pride. When you treated me kindly, you restored my humanity." Such exchanges revealed that the war's true legacy wasn't just victory or defeat, it was comprehension. Memory and recognition. Decades later, when the contributions of the Ritchie boys and wartime linguists were finally declassified, their story re-emerged as one of the most remarkable and least violent triumphs of the Second World War. They had fought not with rifles, but with reason. Their battlefield had been the human mind. Documentaries, interviews, and late-life reunions captured these men, gray-haired now, still speaking perfect German, reflecting on how their knowledge had changed the course of history. Many said they had never fired a weapon in anger, but had watched entire divisions falter because of what they learned through words. When asked what they felt in those interrogation rooms, most gave the same answer. It wasn't revenge. It was understanding. That understanding had rewritten the very language of war. By the time the last POW camps were dismantled in 1946, the lesson of linguistic warfare was firmly etched into the future. The mind, not the gun, decides the outcome. And in that final reckoning of human will, fluency had become a form of victory all its own. The war ended, but the echoes of its voices did not. Long after the battlefields were cleared and the flags folded, what lingered was not the sound of gunfire. It was conversation. Words spoken in winter barracks, in dim interrogation rooms, in the silence between questions. They had done something no bullet could. They had turned understanding into strength. The story of the German POWs who were shocked to hear perfect German from American soldiers is more than a historical curiosity. It is a testament to the quiet revolution that took place beneath the noise of war. The idea that knowledge, empathy, and culture could disarm even the fiercest enemy. In a conflict defined by dehumanization, the simple act of speaking another's language became an act of both power and humanity. For the Americans, it proved that victory was not only about destroying armies, but about decoding minds. For the Germans, it shattered the illusion that strength lay in pride or purity. And for history, it offered one of the rare moments where the bridge between enemies was built not with treaties, but with words. When those soldiers faced each other across the table, one in uniform with a star-spangled patch, the other with a torn eagle insignia, the war momentarily paused. What stood between them was not hatred, but comprehension. The same syllables that had once fueled propaganda now became the instruments of truth. Decades later, when the last of those bilingual soldiers passed away, their legacy endured in every classroom, embassy, and intelligence unit that still teaches one timeless lesson. To understand is to prevail. The snow of 1944 has long melted, but its message remains, whispered through the pages of history, carried by those who believe that even in war, language can reveal something greater than victory. The shared humanity beneath the uniform. And so, in the quiet aftermath of the bloodiest century, one truth still stands. Sometimes the mightiest weapon a soldier can wield is not the rifle in his hands, but the language on his tongue. You just witnessed one of the most unbelievable true stories of WWII. Imagine how many more are still hidden in the archives. Tap subscribe now. New episodes drop every week uncovering the real intelligence battles, secret operations, and human moments that changed the war forever. Don't miss what history tried to forget.